No word permeates our political culture more than democracy.
The pendulum of power swings. It falls on each of us to be guardians of our democracy.
My administration will reclaim power from this unaccountable bureaucracy, and we will restore true democracy to America again.
Mr. President, the Constitution is the foundation of our American democracy.
Every one of us who has sworn the oath must act to prevent the unraveling of our democracy.
And please fight for American democracy.
We cannot ever give up on the ideals that are the foundation for our system of democracy.
But we're not a democracy, and we've never been one. Now, I don't claim to be a political theorist, but I do understand history and our institutions, and I've formed an argument grounded in reality. I know you might have some ideas about democracy and may be a bit skeptical of my claim, but stick with me until the end. You may end up agreeing with me, at least in spirit. So, in the next few minutes, I'll show you how, despite the rhetoric of past and current leaders, the United States is not a democracy and has never been one. But before we get started, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Let's start with the founding fathers and the origins of the nation. I challenge you right now to tell me how many times democracy is explicitly mentioned in any of our founding documents, whether it's the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, or the Constitution. Pause this video if you like and see if you can find out, or just ask Google or AI. You done? The number was 0, right? That's not a coincidence. And people is not a synonymous term with democracy. Now, if you ask the robot or you're a student of history, you may know about the Federalist Papers, where democracy is explicitly mentioned. Negatively, that is. In fact, the only direct mention of democracy in any major founding documents are the Federalist Papers. Alexander Hamilton, one of the principal authors of the essays, called democracy, quote, a disease of which popular governments perish, end quote. So the founding fathers didn't really mention democracy, except negatively as something to avoid. What did they call and frame our government as then? Again, you may know this answer: a republic. Now, I've heard many intelligent people use democracy and republic interchangeably in the same breath to describe the United States. That doesn't make any sense. The founding fathers understood a clear distinction between the two types of government. They had the clear of intention of establishing a republic. To understand the difference between democracy and republic, we have to go back to ancient history, because that is where the founding fathers are drawing their inspiration. The founders were raised on the classics, and that is classics with a capital C, referring to the literary works of ancient Greece and Rome. Within a work by an author named Livy is a description of when the Romans threw out their last king, Tarquin the Proud, and had struggled to figure out how they would run their government effectively. Livy tells us that the Romans sent emissaries to Greece to observe and understand how they ran their governments, especially Athens. Now, Athens has the reputation as the democracy, but the Romans were interested in an earlier form of Athenian government that was much more restrained than the democracy that you've heard of. Restraint is key. The Romans learned that a system with a written code, a virtuous citizenry, and a restrained populace would allow them to create a government that commanded authority, but was also participatory. And this is the lesson that the founders took from ancient Rome. A republic, a mixed government with elements of monarchy or single rule, which is represented by the executive, oligarchy, or rule by few, which is represented by the Senate, and democracy, or rule by the many, which is represented in the House of Representatives, would create a balanced and virtuous government. However, this is the 18th century, and who the founders considered the people is evident in who held power in early America: white men who owned significant property. Political power was the sole privilege of a minority of the American people. Women couldn't vote, Black Americans couldn't vote, Indigenous people couldn't vote, poor white men couldn't vote. Now, this is usually where someone might say, well, duh, Andrew, we didn't start as a democracy, but over time we became one. You sure about that? Let's quickly go through the history of the United States, and you tell me when we realize our so called democracy. The 1820s, a major political movement led by the man on your $20 bill, gave the American political system its first major shakeup. Andrew Jackson leads a movement, later termed Jacksonian democracy, to expand voting rights to all white propertied men. How does he do this? By depriving indigenous people of their ancestral land. So now all white men could vote. Oh, shoot. But most Americans still can't vote. So it wasn't then that we became a democracy. So, how about after the Civil War? Surely, after the North defeated the South and slavery ended as a social and economic system, we became a democracy. Oh, well, except that as soon as Reconstruction ended, white supremacists in the South terrorized and murdered elected Black leaders and then created a legal framework for barring Black Americans from political power, commonly known as the Jim Crow laws. So it wasn't then. Well, how about in 1920 with women's suffrage through the 19th Amendment? Then women could vote, unless you were a Black woman in the South, or an Indigenous woman, or an Asian American woman. I guess it wasn't then either. The 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement marks the first time when someone who says we're a democracy finally has some legitimate evidence. Although, just because national laws were passed in the 60s doesn't mean that there wasn't resistance and hesitation, meaning Americans of color didn't really enter politics to at least the 1970s. So there you go. You could make an argument saying for the past 50 years or so, the US has been a democracy. Oh, shoot. I forgot one more stop on our historical tour. 2010, corporations finally got their political rights in the landmark ruling Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, where restrictions on corporate political spending were determined to be limiting speech. And now we have super PACs with billionaire oligarchs and corporate sponsors that can spend endless amounts of money to influence the American public. Which leads me to the first institutional reason why the United States is not a democracy: money in politics. Democracy literally means people power. You, my viewers, how many of you believe that you could win any sort of federal election without millions of dollars? How is that people power? The answer is simple: it's not. It's plutocracy, ruled by the rich. So, money in politics is one institutional reason why we aren't a democracy. Now, let's talk about the low hanging fruit: the Electoral College. This zombie institution makes sense in the minds of the founders trying to temper mob rule, but all the politicians call us a democracy. So, why does this antiquated body remain? To this day, there is not a single federal law that forces electors to vote with the majority they are supposed to represent. How is that people power? If we're a democracy, why not just have a national popular vote? Now let's discuss the most underrated reason why we are not a democracy: no term limits for congressional legislators. Democracy isn't some far fetched thing that can only work in ancient Athens. The idea that entrenched power corrupts is a universal truth. There are so many legislators who have been in office for decades. Their views are largely shaped by the donor class that supports them. In a true democracy, political office would only be held once for a limited period of time, and then you're done. You finish your virtuous duty to the state, and now you can return to your life. But in America, you can stay as long as you like. No wonder our Congress is geriatric. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about has personal meaning for me in my state of New Hampshire, but I'm sure many of you could relate in your states. Dynastic politics. I'll show you the example in my state, and you let me know in the comments if you have the same problem in your own. In the fall of 2026, we have a Senate seat opening up. Jeanne Shaheen, a Democrat who has been both the governor and senator, is retiring. She is old and has occupied that seat on and off for 17 years. The current Democratic representative, Chris Pappas, is aiming for her seat. Who is the leading contender for Chris's job? Her daughter. Yep, because no one else could possibly do the job. We need the Shaheen dynasty to continue. The self delusion of Nepo babies will always astound me, as if they're the only people that can run this state. We just need Jeanne Shaheen's genes. And the Republicans are no better. Who do they run? Chris Sununu, whose daddy was governor and chief of staff to George H.W. Bush, and whose brother was governor. Oh, and Chris has already served in the Senate. Again, why does the Sununu family believe they are so damn incredibly important and brilliant that no one else can possibly run the state? The egotism of Nepo babies is baffling to me. Dynastic politics is not small d democratic. Far from it. It is classical aristocracy and it's gross. Lastly, let's talk about the Senate, a name that comes directly from the Roman Republic and literally means body of old wise men. I guess we left out the wise. In our system, each state gets 2 senators, a decision made at the Constitutional Convention as a compromise to appease smaller states who worried about larger, populated states dominating the government. This compromise was important at the time for getting the necessary votes to pass the Constitution. It made sense then. But now, it's antiquated and probably the most undemocratic part of our federal government. When the country was founded, Americans still had strong local identities and considered their home states to essentially be their own country. The states also had the major role in our electoral process before more small d democratic aspects were introduced to the early republic. But things have changed. Technology and nationalism have made the reasoning behind the Senate obsolete. And when I say nationalism, I mean the idea that we are from the country of America and are Americans instead of identifying with our home states. Regional and state identity exists, but it's not like people today are like, I hail from the country of New Hampshire and I have an entirely different disposition than a man of Georgia or Pennsylvania. No, technology has nationalized our politics. You probably identify with people who share your ideology and political beliefs, whether they live in your state or not. What I'm trying to say is that it made sense in the beginning. But now, the states are illogical as a major component of our political framework. They're historical constructions of the United States expansion across the North American continent. There is no logic behind having states with wildly different populations, each getting 2 senators. All this does is dilute the political power of people in states with large populations like California, Texas, New York, and Florida, to name a few. Why should I in New Hampshire or someone in Wyoming have essentially more political power than people in any of the states I just mentioned? That's not democracy, it's asinine. And I don't buy the self fulfilling logic that we need a Senate just as it is now. Listen, keep the states, keep their governments. But if you want to become a democracy, then the Senate as it currently stands must change. But Andrew, we're a representative democracy. Duh. Yeah, right. Representative. 750,000 people for one representative in the House. Do you feel represented? Do you feel the people's power? The thing is, some level of direct democracy in the digital age is possible. It's been articulated before. And in a country where 128 million people can tune in at the same time to watch the Super Bowl, I find naysayers to be far less convincing. The point of this monologue isn't to advocate for democracy, but I'm tired of the rhetoric not matching reality. I'm tired of the hypocrisy. I'm tired of the grandstanding. If politicians want a democracy so bad, then make one. Otherwise, do us average folk a favor and shut the hell up, because we're not a democracy and we've never been one. This is Andrew's take. See you next time.